If you've been surfing the internet for a while now, you've probably come across this type of image. Well, this style has been called the aesthetic style, but this is not just about photos. Doing a little research, you'll realize that this can apply to almost anything you imagine. Aesthetic music, aesthetic clothes, aesthetic makeup, among many others. This, more than a style for many, has become a kind of ideology of life. But where does it come from? If we base ourselves on the meaning of the word aesthetic, it would be a set of principles that underlie and guide the work of a particular artist or artistic movement. From here arise questions like, what makes an image beautiful? Or what is the meaning of what we consider beautiful? Under this concept, in the 19th century, aestheticism, or the aesthetic movement, was born by a group of people who were enchanted with Victorian art and thought, and that one of its main characteristics was its practical sense. Utilitarianism. That is to say that the basis of everything was its function. Let's keep in mind that this was when the Industrial Revolution had already exploded, so they were very much in sync. Then aestheticism was born against their thoughts of the Victorian and what industrialization meant. In this case, they mainly criticized that they made repetitive designs using soulless machines. In art in particular, they said that a painting didn't necessarily have to express a particular political, moral, or ethical thought or some kind of history. But that art could exist for the sake of art. That was one of their great slogans, where the main focus was the search for beauty and self-expression. They sought greater freedom to create and explored in form, color, and composition, in search of that beauty. Of that aesthetic sense, of being able to evoke an emotion or a feeling through a painting without thinking that there is something rational behind it. In more specific terms, unlike Victorian exuberant decoration that used weird curved shapes everywhere and had a lot of detail, aestheticism was characterized by using geometrical designs, simple shapes, and subdued colors. Inspired by Japanese art and design. Then, if we take the subdued colors and Japanese influence, we can see how we have two key elements of the current aesthetic side. One of the characteristics of aestheticism is that it could be found in different areas. In design, in architecture, in the fine arts, and even in literature, where they observed Oscar Wilde, who was one of its greatest exponents. In Dorian Gray's portrait, he says art is rather useless. Very similar to the motto of aestheticism, which is art for art's sake without any intrinsic function in the work. Another important representative of the movement was William Morris, who was a famous designer and iconic for his handling of textiles, where we can find the classic floral patterns that have been taken up quite a lot today. And already in terms of clothing, aestheticism was assimilated to something more bohemian and loose, as opposed to the pompous Victorian dresses. A curious fact is that it is said that from this movement emerged the way in which the paintings are exhibited in the gallery today. That is, the painting is the focus of the place, and the rest are white walls without any decoration or elements that distract attention. At the end of the 19th century, aestheticism began to be seen in a ridiculous way. It was taken as a mockery. Comedy works emerged that made fun of this, and so it was diluted. Its representatives went to other movements. Now back to the present, let's stop in 2011, where we find this genre or subgenre called the Vaporwave that probably many already know. This is characterized by taking extracts of songs or whole songs and remixing them so that they have a retro and chill style. Then they use songs from the 80s or 90s, they put a lot of reverb, many synthesizers, jazz samples, and sometimes they put in as dialogues from old movies or propaganda from the 80s and 90s. The Vaporwave exploded on the internet, accompanied by some very particular visuals that began to be called aesthetic. Let's say that from then on this word began to be used to define this type of visuals. These visuals are really a bunch of nonsense. They have retro elements from the 80s and 90s, they use Greek statues, very bright color palettes, they include Japanese characters, and they usually bring technological things from the 80s and 90s. Then we can see logos from Windows 95, the classic blue screens, the Internet Explorer, and that mid-style VHS. These visuals became very popular in Tumblr, and their everything exploded. Although for a good part of the internet also all this was seen as a meme, which if you look at it the same way with the amount of references that they mix, is not that far away. Obviously for many people the Vaporwave is a very important genre. Curiously, this mocking and memeing was exactly what happened with aestheticism in the 19th century. In parallel to this type of aesthetic and Tumblr, two new styles were also emerging, which would be the Japanese and Korean minimalism and the vintage. Then on the side of minimalism also collects retro garments such as jeans, skirts, blouses brought from the 90s and 80s, but they are no longer recharged images like those of the Vaporwave, but are quite the opposite. The clothes are flat, the color palettes are monochromatic and pastel, and usually in the photos there are not many elements. Again, very much influenced by the Asian, for example, it's very similar to the style they use miniso in everything. So you see the relationship with 19th century aesthetics, the Japanese influence in both the Vaporwave and the more minimalist aesthetic, the subdued color palettes, the use of photographs that simply convey a feeling or a type of emotion beyond a story. As far as vintage is concerned, as its name suggests, it basically tries to imitate photos taken 30 to 40 to 50 years ago. In addition, they usually try to include natural elements such as flowers. Do you remember I told you about William Morris and his flower patterns? Or for example, let's look at this other painting that if we put a sad song on it and the lyrics in front of it could easily be from these aesthetic videos on YouTube that look so nostalgic. Then I don't know, it seems to me very interesting that a 19th century movement is being replicated today, obviously in a much more superficial way because now it's like something is nice and already, but there are still very direct connections. I don't know if it's something that happened by chance or if someone really thought that way, because there are a lot of coincidences. Even the fact that aestheticism is being mocked is something that's being replicated today. This whole story of aesthetics, of Vaporwave started to become like a meme. I think it's incredible how this kind of thing resurfaces after so long. Clearly this is all a fad, and as all fads will change over time, in fact there are already about 1,000 different aspects that I don't really understand. I hope you loved the video and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.